days and times we're living in, sex and sexuality is such a topic, politically, culture wars wise, every which way. It's really fraught. And hopefully I can offer some thoughts from a Buddhist perspective that may be helpful as we think our way through and feel our way through this kind of rocky terrain of sexuality and sexual misconduct. That is what the third precept is about. And the third precept says, undertake the training to refrain from sexual misconduct or misuse of sensory pleasure. So it's really a broader umbrella. But today, mostly I'll be focusing around sexual misconduct. And the flip side of that, as Susan spoke of earlier this month, undertake the training of offering respect. And if any of us work in agencies or organizations, we've probably had our fill of sexual harassment trainings over many years. And, you may think, oh, I have to do my annual sexual harassment training. And oh boy, here we go. And even that we can bring a more interested, engaged perspective to. What might I learn? How might I be more aware? Even if I've heard this many, many times. And just as with the other precepts, this precept is simply a guideline, a training that we can choose to commit to or not. It's not a thou must or thou must not. It's not a prohibition, not a commandment, but a guideline towards a way of relieving suffering by cultivating restraint from sexual conduct that may cause harm. It's a non-judgmental way of discerning whether sensual or sexual conduct will contribute to my suffering or the suffering of others. Also, just as with any experience, it may be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Sexual experience is no different. We can notice the feeling tone, the Vedana of sexual experience, just as we notice and gain awareness by noting the feeling tone of other experiences. It's not that we should not appreciate pleasant sexual experiences. Again, just as we savor and appreciate other pleasant experiences. Pleasure isn't good or bad. It's just an aspect of our experience to note. It's not pleasure that gets us into trouble, that contributes to our suffering. It's our attachment, our craving, our chasing after, or clinging to that pleasure, whether it's sexual or some other sensory experience. Delicious food, beautiful works of art, whatever sensory experience we may be clinging to and not recognizing its impermanence. It's also not just the harm we may experience from attachment to sexual pleasure. We also may have personal conditioning that involves difficult experiences, including abuse and trauma that create aversion, and trying to find our way into the middle way between these extremes of craving and clinging and aversion may not be an easy process. Again, this precept is an undertaking by me for myself to do my best to observe and practice a certain type of restraint, with the emphasis on practice, not perfection. because I understand this is a beneficial thing for me to do for myself as well as for others. This must be clearly understood. If you don't think it's beneficial for you, don't undertake it. If you do think it's beneficial, but have some doubt about, my ability to keep this commitment, do your best. We do our best with a lot of spaciousness and grace. We need to keep in mind the guidance of Ahipasako. Come and see for yourself whether this is right for you or not. And this come and see for yourself approach is exemplified in the writing of Jose Cabazon, who's holding the 14th Dalai Lama Professor Chair of Tibetan Buddhism at the University of California, if that isn't a mouthful. He and others met with the Dalai Lama over 20 years ago, nearly 25 years ago, asking for the Dalai Lama to clarify his views, Buddhist views on sexual misconduct, especially given that in some classical texts, there's a great deal of prohibition. And at this meeting, the Dalai Lama really stressed his opposition to discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and his commitment to full human rights for the LGBTQ community. And Cabazon states that this really opened up the possibility of rethinking the doctrine of sexual misconduct as a whole, encouraging those present to subject the ethical norms found in some classical texts, particularly those written around the 3rd century, to the type of critical scrutiny that we would apply to any other aspect of the Buddhist traditions. And for Cabazon, this began a 20-year project studying the historical, cultural, linguistic, and rational basis for Buddhist guidelines on sexual misconduct. Particularly those found in classical Buddhist texts. So applying, real rational scrutiny, but not throwing everything out just because it may not fit with our ideas in this time, applying a consensus approach as well. Basically, Cabazon concludes that even though these earlier writers were wonderful scholars and saints, they simply got it wrong when it came to sexual misconduct. And to give you an idea of some of the prohibitions and how nitpicky, excuse my perspective there, they got, it's like, how many orgasms can a person have in one night? And mostly talking about men. I believe it was 5. Now, where they got 5, who knows? And you shouldn't have sex during the daytime. And you should only have sex with certain bodily parts, putting it more generally. So lots of prohibitions. And so why they got it wrong, when you look at it from the context of where they were coming from in trying to provide more concrete answers to what is sexual misconduct, they made the mistake of applying monastic standards onto the general community, the lay community, and their sexuality. And historically and culturally, they were coming from a very male, heterosexual, privileged perspective. And there was no rational foundation for this. So it leaves current scholars and monastics and Buddhists to have the task of rethinking sexual ethics in a way that's both rational and just, in a way that doesn't privilege heterosexual men. that considers the agency of women, the LGBTQ community, and doesn't discriminate against anyone on the basis of sexual preferences, orientation, or anatomies. The details of this more just sexual ethics, at a minimum, he states, must be based on general principles like gender equality and pan-Buddhist doctrinal, comprehensive, all-inclusive Buddhist doctrinal positions. For example, acknowledging that the body is a vehicle for pleasure, but that sexual pleasure, like all sense pleasure, can be a source of attachment and therefore suffering. And that such an ethic must be based on general Buddhist moral principles like the commitment not to do harm to anyone or any particular community. More specifically, Thich Nhat Hanh recommends, do not mistreat your body. Learn to handle it with respect. Preserve energies, sexual, breath, spirit, for realization on the path. For those who aren't monks and nuns, sexual expression is advised to take place within loving, caring, committed relationship. And in sexual relationships, be aware of the potential future suffering that may be caused by behaviors. To preserve the happiness of others, respect the rights and commitments of others, and be fully aware of the responsibility of bringing new life into the world. I mean, certainly we acknowledge that sex is a powerful force, a drive. You know, it's a powerful drive because we need it to sustain the species. It's hardwired in. But it can certainly, it's neither good nor bad. But if you're like me, and hopefully I'm not the only one here, it can certainly create problems. Sexual lapses are not uniquely wicked. And when we engage in sexual misconduct, we can see that and note that and hold ourselves with compassion for our human fallibility. And I'd like to read one of the Jakata stories. These are stories about Buddha's past lifetimes. And this story presents a really forgiving and compassionate response to sexual misconduct. It's called If She Is Dear. And the context is that a king who discovered one of his courtiers was misbehaving in the royal harem, speaking of historical and cultural context, asked the Buddha for some advice about how to handle this. And so the Buddha told this story of the past, long, long ago, when Brahmadatta was reigning in Varanasi. The Bodhisattva was his chief advisor, and the king discovered that one of his wives was having an affair with one of his ministers. Now, the king was, of course, upset, but he also really valued this minister. He was a real asset to the functioning of the kingdom and was a wise person. And he loved his wife dearly. He thought, what am I going to do? So let me ask my advisor. He's wise. He'll give me good advice. So he asks his advisor. And what he asks is, tell me what you think of this situation. At the foot of a lovely hill, there was a beautiful and very pleasing lake. A jackal dared to drink from the lake, even though he knew that a lion was constantly guarding its shores. The advisor caught on pretty quickly. and understood what the king was asking and replied, "Out of the mighty river, all creatures drink at will. If she is dear, have patience. The river is still a river." The king was really happy with this answer and thanked his advisor, and he went and talked to both his wife and the minister while admonishing them and giving them a stern warning. He forgave them for their misconduct. They apologized, broke off their liaison, and became faithful to the king once more. For the rest of his life, the king gave alms and performed many good deeds. And when he passed away, he was reborn in heaven. So the current king, the king of Koala, hearing this story, forgave both the courtier and his wife. And concluding his story, the Buddha identified his birth. At that time, Ananda, one of his chief disciples, was the king, and I was the wise advisor. So we see the forgiveness in that, as well as on the other side of those engaged in misconduct, the acknowledging accountability and choosing to behave differently. So if we make mistakes, we need to recognize, acknowledge them, and try to avoid repeating them, not holding on to guilt or shame. This is why we practice to notice our craving, to develop the capacity to pause and discern what is beneficial and what is harmful, to release the harmful and choose wise action. And since sexual behavior generally involves at least one other person, we practice to increase our awareness of the other's well-being. As Jay talked about earlier this week, not taking what isn't given freely is so connected to not engaging in sexual misconduct. Being sensitive to myself, do I want to give this freely, to give of myself in this way? Am I ready to be vulnerable in this way? Is the other person or people I'm in relationship with, are they giving this freely without coercion, intimidation, or shaming? And, back in the Buddha's day and centuries ago, nobody anticipated the internet and social media. And I think about in that context, all the ways, especially young people, can be intimidated or coerced or shamed around sexuality and sexual conduct, and intimidated into doing things they might not otherwise do. And we really have to be aware of those pressures on our young people. And cultivating respect for the integrity of others is so important in this regard. Discernment with great compassion for what is in the interest of our well-being and that of others. To myself as to others as to myself. And recognizing the potential physical and emotional consequences for myself and others of my sexual conduct, even into the next generation. So, with all that in mind, let's practice. And as always, how can we respect our bodies as we begin our practice? What would the body like? How does it want to be treated in this moment to be at ease? Appreciating how our sensory experience can guide us into bringing some ease and softening and opening into these bodies, as Susan would say, these wind instruments, as we just allow ourselves to settle. and attuning to our breathing, bringing together heart, mind, body into that holding environment that is safe, a place we want to be. To be more aware of ourselves and others. Just noticing where our energy is at this moment. Is there any rattle that can be comforted? Anything stirred up that I can recognize and help to settle, to come to a calm, caring place where I can hold myself gently and kindly. And perhaps noticing what can be released. Releasing any self-judgment or criticism. Not helpful. And just settling into this moment with friendliness and kindness. perhaps noticing feeling tones as they arise, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, letting them come and go without clinging or holding on or pushing away. And when the mind gets caught up in conditioned stories, as it will, appreciate the noticing of that. Tether the mind back to the breathing, breathing to the body, body to the ground. There, my sweetheart. Come on back here. It's okay to be human. Come back to this moment, this place of caring safety. And in the last couple minutes of our practice, it's right for you, expanding your awareness to sense all of us in all our human fallibility, sitting here alone together, sharing our common humanity just as we are. Loving and respecting ourselves and each other just as we are.